Okay, we're back. Non-steroidal hormones. So you have the endocrine gland releasing its peptide or its amine, usually peptide in this case, and we'll say it travels to the blood and it fits into a specific receptor, which is a protein. So now they're going to blow that little area right there up for you. And so here comes the hormone, lock and key, fits into that. And when it does, it causes this protein to change its shape. That protein changes its shape and it activates an internal reaction and such. And so here you have this hormone receptor complex and it produces this G protein, which will produce GTP. You got ATP, adenosine or adenine, you got GTP with guanine. Pretty fascinating. That then goes over here to this adenylate cyclase. And this is what's going to produce the cyclic AMP, CAMP right there. So it's inactive. This travels over, boom, drops off phosphate, activates it. That turns ATP, normal ATP, into cyclic AMP. And then that is a secondary molecule which then triggers or regulates a bunch of other internal reactions within the cell. So how do you stop it? You block it. How do you increase it? You make a hormone or hormone substitute that looks like it. So there's things in the environment that fit here and prevent that, and so you don't get these reactions. There's also things in the environment which will fit into this, trigger the reaction when you don't need it to happen. They call them endocrine disruptors. So you can find articles about that. You can read about that. The steroid hormone, these, remember, they're not stored. They're produced and used and such. You don't store steroids and all. So they pass through the plasma membrane because they're lipids. And once they're in there, they're trying to get to the DNA. And they'll either bind with a receptor complex and then taken into the nucleus, or they will just travel right into the nucleus. But once they're in the nucleus, they bind to a specific area and activate a specific gene, and boom, proteins are produced. Now, if you think about testosterone, you think about taking shots of testosterone, you think about getting bigger muscles like arm muscles and leg muscles and such like that. But you have a bunch of other different types of proteins in the body, not just muscles. So it has an effect on a lot of internal body chemistry. So here comes the steroid hormone. There's a receptor for it. It binds, it goes to the DNA, and then it triggers protein production. So then you have transcription, and the product of transcription is this transcript, messenger RNA. It then travels out, goes to a ribosome where it is translated. And so out here, the body turns that message into a protein. So then that protein goes and does it. It could be an enzyme. It could be all kinds of things. It could build muscle. So when you look at endocrine problems, either you make too much, you don't make enough, or the receptors don't work or they're insensitive to it. You can think of a disease right now that is due to insensitivity to insulin. I'll let you think about that. The master gland of all of this is the pituitary gland. It's in that cella turcica of the sphenoid bone. You remember that? It's connected to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus has your diencephalon, and it's also attached to your amygdala and your pineal gland. All of that plays a role. Your amygdala is your emotions and such, and then you have your thalamus, which is your regulator. That's what goes to the conscious and what stays at the subconscious. So the thalamus and the hypothalamus is your quote unquote, it is made air quotes, reptile brain. It's all the things needed to keep you alive and such. And so the hypothalamus is part of that. Hunger, thirst, body temperature, sexual, the need to procreate and such is all right in there. So when you look at the gland, it's two lobes, and a front and a back, an anterior and a posterior. And the infundibulum is two parts, an anterior and a posterior. Okay. The anterior pituitary is glandular. It'll produce those precursor molecules, and then when triggered by the hypothalamus, it'll then produce the correct stimulating hormone, which then will go to a secondary gland, and then they will then trigger and fire off. The posterior is not. The posterior is neural. And it does not, I mean, I'm telling you, it does not produce any hormones. It stores just two, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. They're produced in the hypothalamus. They travel down the axon of the neurons, and then they're stored in the synaptic knobs at the end in little vesicles. And when triggered, they'll release. So the posterior just releases hormones. The anterior manufactures and releases. So here's your different areas of your glands. I say pineal. If you want to say pineal, have at it. Your hypothalamus, your pituitary, master gland, your thyroid, your parathyroids, your thymus. We're going to come back to the thymus when we get to the lymphatic system. You see your adrenals are on top of your kidneys, so we say they're superior to the kidneys. The pancreas is both endocrine and exocrine and such. And then when it comes to the gonads, the ovaries and testes, we'll come back to those when we do reproduction at the end of this. So the hypothalamus is kind of like the control center, and it releases material that controls the anterior pituitary. And it travels to what's called, it connects up with the pituitary in what's known as a portal system. When we do digestion, we'll mention portal system again, but a portal system is just capillaries, vessel capillaries. It doesn't travel to the heart. The blood does not mix with the brain. There's a blood-brain barrier. The blood doesn't mix. So the neurons in the hypothalamus release their material. It gets picked up in this portal system, which then travels down the anterior portion of the infundibulum, and then it mingles with the cells of the anterior pituitary. Then they produce, receive, and then they're fired, and they produce, and then it travels through capillaries, then out the circulatory system. So the pituitary, anterior pituitary, has about 8 hormones that it's going to release and such. So now the posterior, like I mentioned, here's the nerves and such, and they travel all the way down. So the posterior is neural. And when you look at it under the scope, or when you look at it on the slides and such, when you get all that part worked out here in a day or two, you'll see that it looks fluffy like clouds. So that's how I know it's neural. But this anterior is grainy. It's darker and it's grainy. And so I tell myself if it's grainy, it's glandular. And that's how I know that. So here's that portal system. So here's the hypothalamus. The neurons fire off and they release their neurotransmitters. There's neural hormones is what you're going to refer to them as. They then diffuse across and get picked up in these vessels, which then travel down to the glandular cells of the anterior pituitary, which they trigger what needs to be produced here, and then out the blood it goes out that way right there. So that's that portal system right there. So now, I seem to be saying that they release a hormone and they make something. Look here, they can inhibit as well. So they can say, hey, make this hormone, or they can say, hey, don't make this hormone. It's something to keep in the back of your head. So what do they produce? Here's what I do. I memorize those two. Now, vasopressin is also known as antidiuretic hormone, ADH. You might want to look it up and see how to abbreviate all of these. It makes your life easier, especially in the lab. But here we have the thyrotropinin, which is the TSH, the adrenal corticotropin. This affects the adrenal gland and affects cortisol and such. Luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone has to do with gamete production. Growth hormone tells your cells you can get bigger. Prolactin is for milk. Melanocyte stimulating hormone, figure it out right there, it's for melanocytes. Then your endorphins and your enkephalins. Pain, feeling good and such, and pain relief right there. So they are made from a precursor. The hypothalamus sends a signal, a neural hormone down, says, hey, make this. Then this is the precursor is converted into what it needs. Then that travels to another gland, one of the other glands of the endocrine system, or to the cells themselves. So, growth hormone. It's a peptide. It's released from the anterior pituitary, and the hypothalamus has a couple. It says either release it, and you make it, or it says don't, right? So it helps to maintain the correct levels. And when growth hormone shows up, you will have an increase in size, hypertrophic growth, and an increase in number, hyperplasic growth. So think about that. It also affects bones. Your bones get thicker, they get more dense and such. It causes cartilage to be deposited on the ends of the bone. It's present during your adolescence. It helps you grow. But when your sex hormones kind of quit after puberty and such, because it closes the growth plate, you don't really make enough growth hormone to open that back up. So what happens if you get too little or too much? You have pituitary dwarfism or pituitary gigantism. Thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, this right here, its target is the thyroid. It's produced and released by the anterior pituitary, and it's measuring your thyroid, your T3s and your T4s, your thyroxine levels, if you will. And then your hypothalamus will then release that thyrotroponin releasing hormone, which then will cause your anterior pituitary to release the TSH. And then that goes and affects your thyroid. And it causes the thyroid to produce and release more thyroxine, which then goes and causes a higher metabolic rate in the body. Gonadotropins, these affect your gonads, which is your sex glands and such, which affects your sex cells production and all. And then the prolactin is for the maintaining of milk production. You're going to read the first milk is the colostrum, and the oxytocin causes that to be let down. That's called the letdown. And then after that first colostrum, when you actually start producing milk due to the suckling, so milk production is a positive feedback, then the prolactin levels will go up and you'll produce milk. So the posterior pituitary, it only stores, and it releases antidiuretic hormone, which is called vasopressin. That affects blood pressure. And oxytocin. The oxytocin is such, it does a lot more than just uterine contractions, but we're just going to feature it in when we do the reproductive side of this, part of the uterine contraction. But oxytocin does a lot. You could read into that, and you could make a career off of that one. So, all right, we're going to stop right there.